Well, hello there, and welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. Now, a slightly more somber start to today's video because, as of this week, the director Richard Donner passed away. And so, I thought, considering that months ago I said I really enjoyed the experience of returning to Superman the motion picture. And at the time I said I'm very keen to look at Superman 2, particularly the Donner cut that had been made sometime in the early to mid noughties. And one thing and another, I kept putting it off, and I did keep returning to it and thinking, oh, I will get round to this. And then, of course, we learned the news this week of his passing, and I thought, let's actually dedicate some time and look at Richard Donner's vision for the continuation of the Superman saga. Now, in an ideal world, I would have watched Superman 2, the original cut, or the theatrical cut, and then watched the Donner cut to compare them side by side. I didn't do that, partly because I distinctly remember having an increasingly bad time with each Superman film. Now, as I said when I watched the motion picture, when I originally watched it as a kid, I didn't get it. I felt it was all a bit bland, all a bit it didn't have any of the contemporary stylings that would have appealed to me. And it's only as an adult that I now appreciate the grandiose scale of the story and the sort of the pacing and the way that it builds to the arrival of Superman in Metropolis. But in spite of that, I still remember Superman 2 being less good than Superman the motion picture, Superman 3 being even worse, and Superman 4 being an embarrassing travesty. And frankly, with all this drama and politics around the Superman 2, let's call it the Lester cut, and then the Donner cut, I just didn't really fancy going back to watching the original Superman 2 because I remember the things about it I didn't like. And I'm sure there are other subtle things that I can't remember, both good and bad, that have been changed for this cut. But it just, as a whole, it didn't seem like a particularly worthwhile exercise for me. So I just sort of jumped straight in, and there are things I distinctly remember, just very key changes that were made to Superman, to this cut of the film. Just to give some background. So, famously, when Superman the Motion Picture had completed wrapping, the way Donner was shooting it meant that he went straight on into pre-production of Superman 2 and had even gone into principal photography. And actually, I think famously he filmed about 70% of the footage for Superman 2. However, due to some studio politics, it then came about that Donner was fired from the role of director of Superman 2, and they brought in Richard Lester, who took over. But as Richard Lester himself said at the time, well, a little while after making Superman 2, they have very distinctive styles. Donner is very much, like with the motion picture, a grandiose, he wants to tell these great Greek myth-style epics that have different sections to them, have this sense of pace and scale and pathos to them, that you feel like you're watching important narratives. Whereas Lester's more interested in human interest. He cares more about character and, I suppose, the everyday actions of people. So the best way to put it is that Donner sees Superman as a god, living as a man, whereas Lester sees Superman as a man who just happens to have godlike powers. And that's very much the difference in their shooting styles. So, in the original Superman 2 cut, it's it's a lot goofier. Lester veers more towards comedy, and of course, when you get to Superman 3 with Richard Pryor, you get to that point where it's almost it practically is a comedy, because Lester prefers the humour. He prefers, again, it feeds more into the human interest aspect of it, that he's aware that this could be seen as goofy, and he leans into that, whereas Donner leans more into the self-importance of it. And you could really see that in Superman 2, the original cut, and it really shows this sort of inner conflict in the film, where most of it is this scaled big drama, and then there would just be comic elements that just really stood out, and characters would act quite caricaturishly. So decades and decades pass, and eventually obviously, in filming terms, a director doesn't just film, say a film's 2 hours. They don't just film 2 hours of footage. They film 20 hours of footage. They film, they have their reels and reels and reels of footage, things that they're testing, different takes, different cuts, entirely different reshoots of scenes. And so with the Superman 2, the footage that Donner had shot, all of the unedited reels were still in existence. And in the early noughties, a team of young filmmakers got together, and I don't know quite how, but they acquired the unedited reels of Donner's original footage and decided to try to use that to rebuild a truer version of Richard Donner's vision of Superman 2. Now, Richard Donner himself had divorced himself from the whole project. He didn't, obviously, because of his how he'd ended his relationship with the Superman story, he wasn't that interested in coming back to it, even for this re-edit of Superman 2. And then, I don't quite know what convinced him, whether he sort of started to see some of the stuff they were working on, or the labour to which they'd gone to try and do this, but eventually he did get involved, and it also involved different types of footage. So, as they point out at the beginning of the film, it's not, some of this stuff is like test footage, so it looks a little jankier. And of course, in the post-production process, the methods of post-production have wildly changed since the 1980s to now, or at least even to 2010s. And so there's some really nice mixing that's done, where you go, oh, that's definitely a contemporary mixing process. But some of it obviously doesn't quite work, with the music, the dialogue, and just some of the editing is quite clearly having to be stitched together, because of course they can't reshoot anything, or they can't reshoot anything involving the actors. They could reshoot like stock footage, I suppose, or establishing, but they are very limited in what they can do to reconstruct this. And as I say, having Richard Donner come back and work with them, and them try to make this, and of course this having been completed sometime after Christopher Reeve's passing, means there's this real labour of love to it. And so even in spite of its successes and failures, and things that didn't work at the time, and things that didn't work in the re-edit, you have to acknowledge the craftsmanship and the passion that goes into taking a film like this and going, we want to make it as the original director envisioned. It's funny, of course, because time repeating itself, with, of course, Snyder and the Snyder Cut of Justice League, you get that sense of, if people love things enough, a passionate fan base will, and of course, if there's some kind of drama that means a director doesn't get the opportunity to complete a project, the passion of the fans will make it happen. And this film is a lot better than the original cut. There are just certain things that frustrated me, particularly surrounding the Superman-Lois relationship, and the fact that she knows he's Superman as Clark Kent and is trying to expose him. Now, in the Lester cut, the circumstances are a lot more awkward. It's a lot more... it involves incredibly reckless decision-making on Lois's part, and pure serendipity that she actually is able to prove his identity involving him, like, touching fire, basically. And it's awkward, and it works, but it doesn't entirely work, and it feels unearned. Whereas in this version, and it is a lot darker, because essentially this version of Lois Lane, as she's portrayed in the first act of this film, is almost a sociopath. That she very quickly decides that Clark Kent is Superman, and her first response is to jump out of a window. When Superman manages to rescue her whilst also not concealing his identity, she lets it go for a bit, and then because of circumstances, she's then her suspicions are reawakened. At which point, she points a gun at him as Clark Kent, threatening to shoot him, and then does shoot him. Now, as it transpires, this was all a deceit, because it turns out, once he's revealed that he's Superman, she reveals that the guns were blank. And that is clever. That's actually a really clever way to do the Lois revealing Superman. It shows that she's put forethought into it and a plan. It gives her autonomy, but also feels like something that would happen to Superman. Now, the other thing I really like about this is the way, I mean, even from the first film, they established Terrence Stamp as Zod, and Terrence Stamp is such a... I mean, this film, as I said, for Superman the motion picture, is so well cast. It's so meticulous. Every actor is perfect for their role, and none more so than Terrence Stamp as Zod. Particularly with the fact that they cast Zod, Ursa, and Nom in the first film for one scene, with the intention of bringing them back for the sequel. Now, obviously, they, like I said, shooting immediately started on Superman 2, so it wasn't like there was a years and years wait. But still, the way that they managed to have Terrence Stamp and just be this force for the film. Now, I don't remember in the original cut how much has been restructured, but this version of Zod, Ursa, and Nom are much more intimidating than I remember, particularly with the small town and the escalation of the threat. I mean, they do that thing where they establish them escaping from the Phantom Zone. And that's something else I really like, is the fact that, obviously, knowing that this was going into production straight after the original, the events tie directly into the consequences of the original film. So, Superman throwing the the missile into space releases Zod and his cohorts from the Phantom Zone. And that's really nice, because it means, this is a film about choices and consequences, and that theme comes up again and again. And they do establish them, and this, I remember this from the original cut, or at least I think I do, that, of course, the murder of the astronauts, which shows them as a threat. Then they arrive on Earth, and I was a little worried, because there's this whole thing about them confronting a police officer and demonstrating their powers, but not necessarily in a way, in a slightly goofier way than I was remembering. And I was thinking, oh, is this going to be one of those situations where they'll seem like a threat, but without hurting anyone? They'll just sort of do a severe amount of property damage, because it's an 80s film. It's not going to be particularly, and it's an 80s superhero film. It's not going to be particularly violent or bloodthirsty. I was completely wrong. The way that it escalates in this small town, from them confronting this police officer and trashing his car, to going into the small town, to throwing people around, property damage, and you think, okay, that's sort of the level I expected. But then they start killing people. Particularly this young boy who tries to flee the town on a horse, and they just actively murder him. They just kill him. And to the point where someone says, you just killed that boy, and they say, well, now he'll never become a man. And it shows the threat of them. That's quite impressive. And what I like about this, the way that this is put together, is the fact that it's not a case that Superman is just letting this happen. Whereas in the original motion picture you had a very clear story to story to story, where you go from the fall of Krypton to the rise of Kal-El to Superman, the trial of Superman, you could say, as a sort of 3-act structure. And you can see, and within that you see chapters where you see how it goes from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. And I think that worked so well for that one. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't quite do the same thing in this. This is more like an interweaving of different stories. So you have the Superman and Lois story, and initially it does feel a bit like, well, are these just going to be 2 separate events? But what you come to realise, and this is what I was saying about a story of consequences, is that, of course, Superman takes Lois, goes to the fortress, and they're essentially falling in love, and you're watching essentially their love story and the sacrifice that Superman is going to make to give up his powers, while simultaneously you're seeing the escalation of Zod and his violence. So you see like I say, the violence that happens in the small town, the deaths to the point where they destroy the small town, essentially, to the point where they go to the White House and they essentially attack it, devastate it, and they make the president bow to them. And you see that sense of escalation and conquest in parallel to Superman, who is, of course, falling in love, wanting to calm down, and then confronting Jor-El, and essentially wishing to give up his powers because he wants a normal life. And that's another thing I really like, is the fact that in the original it was an ultimatum, where the implication is you can't be with her unless you're going to be human. And that's, again, something I was never keen on, because it never justifies why. It's just, oh, you have to give up your powers if you want to be in love. In this version, it's a much more open conversation about the fact that essentially he wants to give up his powers because he wants to live as a man, and that he feels that he's given enough to the world that he should be allowed to essentially retire Superman. And it's a conversation between him and Jor-El, or the ghost Jor-El, where Jor-El eventually decides, okay, I'll give you this as your option, which of course leads to the box where he gives up his powers. But it's much more, as I say, a much more autonomous, character-driven decision rather than something that's forced upon his character, and that's a much stronger choice. And of course, you see like I say, the escalation of Zod, as you see almost the de-escalation of Superman as he winds down his powers. And then, of course, we have the discovery, once he leaves the fortress, going back to the real world, powerless, whereupon they discover that the world is in threat, and that, as a consequence to his self-interest, Superman has essentially shirked his responsibilities. And the theming there is really strong. You know, and like I say, it works, an intertwining of these stories. You then also have that weird thing about a guy beating him up in a bar. And I'll come back to that towards the end, because, man, that goes in a very strange direction considering the changes they made. But then it goes back to stuff I do remember, where I like the fact that he goes back to the fortress, and it's a long and arduous journey for him. And then he has another conversation with, like, the tiniest spark of Jor-El, of the power of the fortress left. And then it's a sense of sacrifice, where Jor-El essentially says, I can give you your powers back, but it will cost me everything. And there's a whole thing about the son becoming the father and the father becoming the son. And it's a really nice conclusion to Jor-El's story, that this is the end of Jor-El. And I think that's a really powerful choice. Then we get back to stuff I remember, where he has the confrontation. I remember it being a lot less violent than it was, but that might just be my younger brain wanting a bit more violence. But, you know, people are in threat, and that's obviously the big thing, which is Zod realising that, that if he threatens people, that's what weakens Superman, because he's too distracted saving people to also fight 3 other Kryptonians. Then we have the stuff in the fortress, and of course the trick and the reverse of the machine, which of course takes away Zod, Ursa, and Nom's powers, and then the murder of Zod, Ursa, and Nom, which to this day, in spite of I remember it from the original, is oft discussed in all the different ways I've read and seen discussions about it. as far as we can tell, yep, he just murders them. There is a sort of get out in this version, but in terms of intent, he and Lois actively murder two people, and the third guy sort of kills himself-ish. Which, hey, you don't really, if you don't think about it, you don't sort of put the pieces together, but it's just that strange thing where you go, oh, wow, okay. And then you get to sort of the ending, and the ending change is really strange. Because in the original, of course, famously, there was the super kiss that erased Lois Lane's memory, and that was it. In this version, and I don't remember this at all, or this having ever been discussed, Superman reverses time, like he did in the original motion picture. Now, I'm not being entirely truthful. I do remember there being discussions of the fact that Donner wanted to end Superman 2 with the time reversal rather than the original. But for whatever reason, he got talked into, or felt that it was a stronger climax, I don't know, to end with the spinning around the world in the first one. And then, so he decides to then do it a second time with the ending of this one in this cut. And it does make sense, because if you establish it in the first one, why not use it, sort of do a repeating motif for the second one? And it's not like it undoes, like, everything still needed resolving before the reverse time, but it allows Superman to be able to undo some of his mistakes. But it's still very odd. It's still a very odd thing to have happen, and it puts into question who remembers what. It implies, therefore, that maybe in this timeline, Superman doesn't hit the Phantom Zone with the nuclear missile, so that means that they don't escape, and they aren't then murdered in the Arctic. Or Antarctic. Oh, I've forgotten. But it just seems like a very escalating way to resolve what is essentially mostly the Lois Lane problem. And of course, it undoes the deaths of all the people that we see. I suppose that's the other reason. But there is one other thing that happens, which again, this was in the original cut as well, but it made a little more sense. It doesn't make Superman any less. It doesn't make it any less of a dick move on Superman's part. But essentially, he goes back to the bar where he got beaten up when he didn't have powers, and beats up the guy this time, but obviously, enough to just sort of embarrass him, I suppose, but not so much that he shows his full Superman powers. Now, in the original cut, makes sense, I suppose, because people would know, and it's sort of, it allows him to, quote-unquote, get revenge. Not the best move, but at least it makes sense. In this version, if Superman rewound time and then beats this guy up, this guy has no reason to know why Clark Kent, this random guy who's just walked into the bar for the first time, the diner, sorry, for the first time, has just randomly started beating him up. And it makes Superman, it's a bit of a, it's not very cool to sort of do that. And it is funny, and it was obviously played for a humorous bit at the end of the film. But it's just such a odd thing, especially considering that this is obviously a re-edit, and the scene is unnecessary. You could have ended with the previous scene. But yeah, it's an odd choice. There are other things that I don't think entirely work. As I said, the casting's perfect, the characterization's. There is one thing that I don't think works as well in this, and I don't remember if it worked better in the Lester cut, but I don't prefer. Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor in motion picture was the right balance of humorous, psychopathic, and also intelligent. In this version, sorry, that's the original motion picture, and I thought they just managed to hit those beats in exactly the right way to make him a credible threat, whilst also kind of being humorous and kind of being charismatic, if you like that kind of person. In this in this sequel, he comes across a lot stupider. He does the big caricature Lex Luthor thing, the most brilliant man in the world, but it comes across more caricaturish. And the interactions he has with Otis and Tessmacher are a lot more comedic, to the point where in the original they were funny, but they were funny because they were bouncing off each other. Whereas in Superman 2 it feels like it's being written for jokes, as if jokes are being set up and paid off. And it makes the characters, all three of them, look just that bit dumber and just that less credible. And then, of course, you lose Otis and Tessmacher. They just sort of aren't in the rest of the film. This is only for the first bit. But again, the Lex Luthor we see, I just don't think I like this portrayal as much as I liked the motion picture. Maybe that's only because we only got a small amount of him. But I just don't think I like this, the way that he's kind of snivelling and also trying to have bravado. But then also comes across as quite dumb. And I don't know, it doesn't quite work for me. And it's not Gene Hackman, because he is as charismatic as always, but it just doesn't quite work. But anyway, but as a whole, I am really glad I've seen this. I think it was a great exercise to see the re-editing of a film like this. And again, I think in terms of film studies, I think the exploration of how you can take an existing film and recut it to essentially be the same film, and yet with key differences. It's genuinely a masterclass. And again, it's really great to be able to honour Richard Donner. You know, we're at that point now where a lot of the cast has passed away. I mean, Gene Hackman's still with us, I believe, Terence Stamp. But again, this is becoming that point where the Superman films, particularly these two, are becoming these like archival records of film history. I still think I much prefer the motion picture. It feels a lot more cinematic, whereas this is, or at least it feels identifiably cinematic, like it stands alone as this great film, whereas Superman 2 is a lot more, I suppose it's a lot more in the kind of thing you would expect from a superhero movie, even in this age. The plot beats, the characterizations, it doesn't quite have the same grandiose Greek god style that the motion picture has. But I still think it was really interesting, and it was good to see. And again, apparently Terence Stamp is really getting quite a few looks in, because I feel like I'm charting the course of his career over these videos. And it's great because he is a tremendous actor. Anyway, I really enjoyed this, and it was a very, very fun film experience. Thank you for joining me. If you like this video, hit the like button, comment below, and share this video to help me in the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and hit that little bell to get notifications of when new videos are uploaded. Check out my back catalogue of over 150 videos, almost getting to that 200, getting closer and closer. And follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I'm always tweeting about films and TV shows, and I share these videos once they're uploaded to YouTube, either the day of or the day after. Thank you for joining me. Take care.